I am still so irritated at Comey and that sanctimonious attitude that he has over the Devin Nunes memo, portraying it as if it has single-handedly destroyed the reputation of the FBI, whose integrity is beyond reproach. First of all, let's remember that the memo points to the leadership and the things that they did against Trump. It doesn't speak to anything about the institution or the agents, none of that. But I digress. I want to share a story, a real story, showing how an administration will weaponize the Department of Justice and the FBI to go after a citizen it perceives to be a threat. The characters of this story are the following. There's 5 characters. You have Stanley Levison, who was a former member and financier to the American Communist Party. By the mid-1950s, he refocused his attention and his funds to the civil rights movement in the United States and won Martin Luther King Jr., who he ended up becoming one of his closest friends and advisors. The other 3 characters are a young Democratic president, JFK, John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert, who became his attorney general, and the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. It's 1961, and Kennedy is very concerned about the rising influence and popularity of Martin Luther King Jr. So much so that to minimize the exposure that King was getting, he did not even invite him to his inauguration. He did not even invite him to the very first meeting he held in the Oval Office with civil rights leaders to talk about the civil rights movement. King was not a part of that. Kennedy had several concerns. One of them had to do with the fact that he perceived them as having too close ties to communists. He also had heard in different circles about King's reputation for having extramarital affairs. And that's something that he was concerned about. Any close association to King would tarnish his own reputation, which is incredibly ironic, but I digress. The main concern is that because of the influence that Martin Luther King Jr. had on the civil rights movement and the public opinion in the subject, he was being forced to make changes and address civil rights in a way that he was not prepared nor eager yet to embrace. So much so that when he learned about the plans to march on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. ended up making the famous and historically important speech, in anticipation of that, he recruited white labor and union groups to show up at the march to make sure that they would contradict any narratives about whites not being ready to embrace sweeping civil rights changes. Okay, so now you have an FBI that will end up being weaponized because to Kennedy it was all about preserving his legacy and about him being the one that directed the civil rights movement. So they proceeded to look for a way to mount a campaign to destroy Dr. King's reputation. And how did they do this? March 1962, Robert Kennedy authorized the surveillance of Levison. They already knew he was a communist, but they ordered the surveillance of Levison, and they knew his close association with Martin Luther King. By October 10th, whatever was collected in between, it was used to justify the surveillance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. The excuse, of course, was just his friendship with Levison, the communist. So they broke into his office. They wiretapped and debugged his home, his office, his hotel rooms, and they struck gold. They did not find any connections to Russians, or they didn't find that he was really a classic communist. None of that. It was even better. They got evidence of the extramarital affairs. So they proceeded to leak the full salacious details of his sexual activities as they were documented through the wiretaps from his phone conversations with his mistresses. They even went to the extent to draft an anonymous letter, which is believed to have been written by J. Edgar Hoover himself, detailing everything that was uncovered and the fact that they were going to release everything to the public. They even they even suggested to Dr. King that he may want to consider committing suicide. This is not fake news. This is being very well documented by even left-leaning publications like the Huffington Post, Washington Post, New York Times. And ironically, is as a result of President Trump having authorized the release of the JFK files. Yeah, which brings me to today. We have President Obama, an election campaign, his concerns for preserving his legacy through the election of Hillary Clinton. You have his attorney generals, Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch, willing to protect Hillary Clinton. And you have FBI directors Mueller and James Comey. People, in my mind, based on every document and report that I've read, I think this goes way beyond some rogue FBI, DOJ leaders trying to bring down Trump. I mean, look at what has been uncovered through congressional hearings, and now the summary provided by Devin Nunes by his memo. You have Carter Page, a person who the FBI knew going back to 2013 that he had association with the Russians. And the association, loose as it may be, or having various degrees of separation to Russian leadership, he acquired it through having worked for Merrill Lynch in Moscow for 3 years, at which time he developed some close connections and relationships with people in the gas sector. The FBI was in communications with Carter Page as a result of that since 2013. Fast forward to the beginning of 2016, and somehow Carter Page ends up as an informal policy advisor to candidate Trump. For the life of me, I looked at any kind of connections that Carter Page might have had to Donald Trump or to his associates or his family. I couldn't find any. But here he was. Somehow he got in front of the campaign and he managed to get into that position. Fast forward to June, when the first FISA request mentioning Trump was presented to the FISA court. That one was turned down. And to give you an idea of how bad and how lame it had to be, it was turned down. There were about 34,000 requests for surveillance to the FISA court between 1978 and 2012, of which only 11 were turned down. So again, imagine how bad the one from June had to be. By October, they narrowed the scope, okay? And in the meantime, there was a document that started being developed, okay? And so when they went back to the FISA court, they focused on Carter Page. They said that they needed to use surveillance for him, on him. And they utilized as justification this dossier, this document that contained salacious information obtained from Russians, paid for by the DNC and the Hillary campaign, and put together by an ex-MI6 agent, Christopher Steele, who was openly against Trump and was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that he was not elected. None of these details were presented to the judge because, of course, you can imagine it would have been turned down as well. So, now, one side note that I find very curious is the fact that Carter Page is walking around in spite of all the surveillance and everything, whatever they've uncovered for years, going back to 2013, he's walking around like nothing, unscathed, which I think is a little odd, but just a little side comment. So, my humble opinion, we've been there, they've done that, and this is not about rogue FBI agents or leadership. This goes way deeper, way higher and way deeper, and I'm afraid that we're witnessing the beginnings of Obamagate.